Hello, and welcome to this lecture series that I'm titling Exodus, Jewish Immigration from Russia, 1881 to 1924. I'm Jerry Franz, a history professor. The subject of Jewish immigration to the United States is so large, we are going to narrow our focus to Russian Jewish immigration from 1881 to about 1924. And what drove them out of Russia to places like the United States. Second, we'll consider the American Jewish response to the plight of Russian and Eastern European Jews then. So let's first discuss the Jews in Russia and in Eastern Europe, and get ready for some statistics, which I hope will be helpful. In 1880, close to 6 million of the world's 7.7 million Jews, or approximately 75%, lived in Eastern Europe. So that blue column is Eastern Europe, including Russia. At the time, only 3% of Jews were in the United States. You can see the small percentage there on top. Most of those American Jews, that top 3%, had come from Germanic areas of Central Europe. Only 1/6 of American Jews had come from Eastern Europe. Okay, 17 years later, in 1897, Russia conducted their first official census and found almost 5.2 million Jews. About 4% of Russia's population, but fully half of the world's Jewish population then. And 94% of these Russian Jews were confined to the Pale of Settlement. Okay, what was the Pale of Settlement? Think of the word pale as meaning a fence or border. We have a saying that if something is excessive, we say that's just beyond the pale. And you can see that means like beyond the fence limit, out of bounds. So the Pale of Settlement was a bordered area comprising the western provinces of Russia and Russia-controlled Poland. Imperial Russia did not care for the Jews, but as a result of their growth westward in the 1770s through the 1790s, they ran into a large Jewish population. The leader, Catherine the Great, started the Pale in 1791 by creating this boundary wherein Jews could live, and therefore Russia would not have to tolerate them throughout the empire. But there were other ethnic groups and religions represented in the Pale as well. The Jewish population varied over time from 9 to 18% of the Pale, but the larger population had the laws and favor on their side. So the Jews went from secure, prosperous residents of Poland to unwanted and greatly restricted resident aliens within the Pale. Jews numbered about 1 million at first, but by the end of the 19th century, they were 5.5 million. Now, in the Pale, the Jews endured a lot of social and economic discrimination, leaving them very poor, fighting hard to make each month's rent. All it took for new restrictions upon the Jews' economic activities were new complaints by Gentile competitors. I say competitors because that was a big issue. Those around the Jews felt that the Jews should not be allowed to compete in the market with them. So the restrictions against the Jews more and more resulted in a segregated people only competing with themselves. Now, we are fortunate that from 1912 to 1914, a Jewish scholar named Shlomi Anskai traveled to 70 different Pale settlements and collected a lot of interesting stories, folklore, music, etc., about life in the Pale. You can see the note about him in the photograph in this slide. In recent years, 160 of his photographs have come to light and were published in 2014 in a book called Photographing the Jewish Nation. Now, we wish the entire collection of Ansgai's work was still available, but some was lost in World War II bombings. But the pictures still give us an important glimpse into their Jewish culture then, like children at play. A typical home, which, by the way, held far more family members than the average. Most had about 8 in that Pale, and the Jewish average was about 15. Again, because of expense and limitations. Here's their marketplace. Again, they were not allowed to compete with Gentiles and not allowed to do business on Sundays or on any Christian holidays, lest a Gentile would be tempted to come over and purchase from them. Now, we could say more, like the nabbing of young Jewish men pressed into a 25-year military term, but with restrictions on their promotions. The Russians drafted the Jews at a much higher draft rate percentage than other groups. It's hard to imagine how this situation could be worse in the Pale. But actually, the world of Russian Jews was about to explode. Sofia Perovskaya was a 28-year-old Russian terrorist. Her father was a prominent government official, but Sofia's education was neglected, like with most women then. And that was a big mistake. Sofia filled her mind with the revolutionary ideas of her day and became a prominent terrorist leader. On a cold day in March 1881, she stood next to a road in St. Petersburg. She took out a handkerchief and wiped her face. It was a signal to other terrorists watching. The carriage transporting Tsar Alexander II turned onto a different road, trying not to be predictable. But the terrorists had every contingency covered. Then the bomb was thrown. It exploded directly beneath the royal coach. However, the coach was bomb-proof, that is, with a sheet of metal underneath. The Tsar emerged from the smoke. Thank God, he said, he was fine. But others around the coach were injured, and the Tsar sought to help them, not even thinking of any further danger. Another terrorist threw a second bomb directly at the Tsar. The assassination sent a shockwave across Russia and Eastern Europe. The terrorists hoped that this would start a revolution. It did not. All the terrorists, including Sofia, were rounded up and hung. But there was a massive response to the assassination in both Russia and Eastern Europe that was totally unforeseen and unintended, namely, the explosion of violent pogroms against the Jews. Pogrom comes from Yiddish and Russian, from a root word meaning destruction. Mobs attacked the Jews in hundreds of locations in Russia and in Eastern Europe from 1881 all the way to the 1920s. The Jewish people became a convenient scapegoat for the troubles of Russia, even though the terrorist organization was not Jewish. I mean, it was a large terrorist organization. Were there a few persons who were ethnically Jewish? Yes, probably so, but it was not a Jewish organization. But the word on the street and in a very anti-Semitic press was that this was a Jewish plot, and there were strong rumors that Alexander III, the new Russian Tsar, was supportive of the pogroms, even calling for them to avenge the assassination. which we know now was not true, thanks to late 20th century Jewish scholarship. The new Tsar didn't like the Jews, but neither did he like street violence, which could turn against his own government someday. Somehow, amazingly, this downtrodden population of 5 million Jews, set apart in the poverty of the Pale, 4 to 5% of the population of Russia, was perceived to be this great threat. Oh, if there ever was a showcase for the irrationality of anti-Semitism, this was it. The Jews were obviously no threat. In 1882, more restrictive laws were passed against the Jews, and in the wording the Jews were blamed for the pogroms, which is like blaming stores for being robbed. In the context of this raging anti-Semitism, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion was written in 1903 in Russia, a forgery that purported to be the minutes of Jewish elites conspiring to economically take over. Same old tired rumor and stereotype. In 1906, President Theodore Roosevelt sent Philip Cohen, an Ellis Island official and Jew, on an undercover mission to the Pale. Find out what's going on there, Roosevelt told him. Cohen's report described the Jews' appalling poverty and 637 pogroms. Now, I'd like to read a quote of this important primary source from the Times. The killing was barbarous. Nails were driven into the heads of the people. Their bones were broken in their hands and bodies, and then they were clubbed to death with rifles. This went on all day. The killed that day were estimated at 90. He's talking about a certain pogrom. Then Schneider-Mühlhof was set on fire. This was a large wooden building to which many had fled for safety, and here they were burned to death. And concerning the pogrom at Kalarash in 1905, Cohen wrote, "Here was a community of 4,560 souls, of which 3,960 had been Jews. 550 homes, housing 2,000 persons, were destroyed. The people who left went to various places. 100 families representing 500 and odd souls went to America. 16 families representing 60 persons had just gone to Canada, and 15 families representing 53 to Argentina. Given the funds, half the town would migrate. Into the cellars people crept, and there they stayed during the burning and looting, some for 2 days or more. I cannot tell you the tales of their suffering. The water of the city is to be had only at public pumps. Did they dare venture forth? I went into several of these holes in the ground. They were used to store casks of wine, lumber, etc. By measurement they were quite uniformly 8 by 9 feet and about 5 feet high, moist and dark. There was nothing but the damp, dirty floor to lie on. Dr. Chasilev was the only available physician. The tales he had to tell were fearful. Old men brutally handled, young women dishonored under the most horrible conditions, children mangled. When I returned to Odessa, I saw 5 families representing 21 people from Kalarash who, quote, trembling, shrinking from the spoiler's hand, "Thank God," they said to me, "there are noble souls in America, or we would not have these clothes to wear." Hard quotes. The pogroms were not everywhere, but there was always the fear that one would break out in your area. Irving Halperin wrote later, "In Russia, no matter how good things were, there was always the cloud over you that something might explode. You always had that fear. Now, we could read and be shocked for a long time through these many stories in this 189-page report. But let's move on to another source then. Here's a Russian newspaper, the Novoye Vremya, which was not sympathetic to the Jews normally in their articles. But here it gives an account of the pogroms in one area. Many rioters were placed under arrest and put on trial. More than 60 were sentenced by the courts to a term in prison from 8 to 14 months. One of the defendants, a little Russian peasant who had been arrested for having taken part in an anti-Jewish riot, voiced his amazement in these characteristic words. "They told us we had permission to beat the Jews, and now it appears that it is all a lie." So let me say in response, this reinforces what I was saying earlier. The pogroms were not called for by the government, but many believed the rumor that they were. And the government will prosecute some for their attacks, because mainly the government does not want to sanction street violence. The article continued. A pogrom on a more comprehensive scale, arranged in honor of the Easter festival, and lasting for 3 days, that is, April 19 to 21, 1899, was allowed to take place in the city of Nikolaev, the South Russian port of entry. Bands of rioters, to the number of several thousand, among them many newly arrived Great Russian day laborers and a few intellectual ringleaders, fell upon Jewish stores and residences and destroyed or looted their contents, complying faithfully with the established pogrom ritual, while the police and Cossack forces proved, quote, powerless. On the third day, when the news of the freedom accorded to the rioters and robbers at Nikolaev reached the villages in the vicinity, a whole army of peasants, both men and women, numbering some 10,000, started toward the city on their wagons, with the intention of carrying off the property of the Jews. But they were too late, for in the meantime the Cossacks and soldiers had been ordered to stop the pogroms and to disperse the rioters. The peasants were driven off and had to return to their villages on their empty wagons. Exasperated by their failure, the peasants vented their fury upon the Jewish cemetery outside the city, demolishing a large number of tombstones, and then scattering all over the district, made an attack upon the Jewish population in the neighboring settlements and villages. In the Jewish agricultural colony of Nagartava, all farmhouses and stores were wrecked and looted, and the agricultural implements demolished. The Russian peasant was unscrupulously ruining and robbing his Jewish fellow peasant. This newspaper quote is so sad, and it gives another primary source to come to understand how these many pogroms took place. In the account, there were many instances of local government and police participation, and mostly just stepping aside to let the mobs do their work. But then, soon enough, the government soldiers arrived from elsewhere and put the pogroms to an end. And the local police act as if they could not have stopped the pogrom because they don't want a bad report to go back to Moscow. So, in 1881, there were about 200 pogroms. Many began in the larger cities and then spread to the countryside in like a wave. However, to the pogroms were added a second huge challenge: the May Laws of 1882. At this time, Tsar Alexander III declared it illegal for Jews to move into the smaller towns and villages. About 500,000 Jews were expelled from rural areas and were prevented from buying or renting land. They were pushing the Jews into separate urban, impoverished parts of the city, like ghettos. And there the Jews would become even more segregated, more poor, and away from any control of lands and farming where they could have better provided for themselves. Well, the May laws did not produce the kinds of deadly conditions of the World War II ghettos and death camps, but they did increase their unemployment and poverty. Imagine these new rural Jews thrown into the already crowded Jewish sections of the cities, bringing the same limited trades with them that they were allowed to hold. And the cities already had those trades and goods in their area from other urban Jews. Between 1894 and 1898, the number of unemployed Jews in the Pale was 50% or more, depending on the area. The May laws were just one set of laws against the Jews, but the process continued. Soon Jews were not allowed to vote in town elections or use Christian names to obscure their identity. On March 28, 1891, wealthy and established Jews of Moscow who had managed to escape the Pale were awakened in the middle of the night. Most were given 24 hours to leave the city for the Pale or leave Russia. Those without transportation were marched to the Pale by police and soldiers in a kind of trail of tears kind of ordeal. About 20 to 25,000 Jews were pushed out of Moscow then, and whatever property or possessions that were left were quickly taken by either the government or the neighbors, whoever got there first. Now, with all these pogroms, what about the Russian Orthodox Church, their state church? The leader of the Russian Orthodox Church then was Konstantin Pobedonostsev. He was anti-Semitic. He was the one who famously guessed that in the end 1/3 of the Jews would be killed, 1/3 would convert, and 1/3 would emigrate. So that didn't help the Jews to have such a leader of the Russian Orthodox Church. But Constantine was really a politician put in charge of the Holy Synod. Yuri Tabak explains that these high departments of the state church, quote, were essentially government departments, end quote. Since the time of Peter the Great, who was anti-Semitic, the government took a more firm control of the Orthodox Church. However, among the many clergy across Russia, there was less anti-Semitism. Yes, some clergy were anti-Semitic, but many others were either neutral or they even tried to help the Jews. There were also different views among Russian politicians, but they all understood that to go against imperial policy was dangerous. The Tsarist regime was not democratic. For instance, the Russian governor of Bessarabia published his memoirs in 1908, and they later came into English. He wrote, Durnovo, at the time Associate Minister of the Interior, was particularly emphatic in his demand for broader rights for the Jews and against the existing senseless laws concerning them. And then he says, it was my intention always to endeavor to adhere consistently and firmly to the views that the Jews were just as fully Russian subjects as all the other inhabitants of Russia, and, in regard to personal safety, equally entitled to the protection of the law and the government. So, there is evidence that this anti-Semitism was not universal. Okay, I think I'd better give you a break. This first part has been particularly brutal. In our next lecture, I want to move on to our next major point, namely the actual movement of the Jews out of Eastern Europe and Russia. Thanks very much.